Good evening and welcome to our webinar. I'm Chris McLaughlin, Secretary IET Ireland Network. I have some announcements to make in advance of the presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can post them in the Q&A box below and I will pass them to Sarah on your behalf at the end of her presentation. Our next webinar, From Cable Station to Data Centre, will take place on Tuesday 22nd of March at 6:30 p.m. and this webinar is being recorded. I will now pass you to Ching Man, Chair of IET Ireland Network. Ching.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ching Man. I'm the chairperson of the IET Ireland Networks. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar, in particular to the Energy, Environment and Climate Action Division of Engineer Ireland, who are co-holding with us this evening. Our speaker is Sarah Cullen. Sarah is a co-founder and director of 1840, an Irish clean energy group calling for the repeal of Ireland's anti-nuclear legislation. She has worked in planning for the Irish solar sector and in training for the international nuclear and radiation technology sector. I would now like to welcome Sarah to make a presentation. Sarah, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, fantastic. So this is the longest presentation I've ever given on this topic. So I really hope I don't go over, because I was very enthusiastic with the amount of content I could include. I'm going to be talking about nuclear power and what that could look like in Ireland based on the work of my group 1840. So these are the topics I'm going to be talking about. I'll give a very slight introduction to Irish electricity, talk about the pathway to net zero by 2050 internationally and in Ireland. I'll talk about nuclear power generally, and then I'll talk about our findings and what that might look like in Ireland. And then, are there any potential next steps? So, as an introduction to 1840, this is us. Those are all of our members. Anyone is free to become a member if you're interested. Our website is 1840.ie, and you can read all of our bios and see all about us. We are nearly all engineers, but we also have a few medical physicists and radiation specialists. We all work on an entirely volunteer basis. It's all out of public interest. So we have absolutely no vested interest in the Irish power sector or in nuclear power being developed in Ireland. We just want to contribute to the conversation. And you'll see throughout this presentation how we're doing that. So just to begin, these are SEAI's numbers for the Irish electricity mix. So we're about 60% fossil fuels at the moment and about 40% wind. This has changed a lot over the last few years, and you'll see that the share of renewables, which is predominantly wind, has grown rapidly. And Ireland is a world leader in integrating variable renewables into our grid. Ireland's grid actually has a brilliant track record. Kind of one of the first major investments by the new Irish state was, I think they invested like 40% of our GDP into the Shannon hydroelectric scheme, which still provides about 0.5% of our electricity today. So the Irish electricity sector has a long track record and continues to be a world leader and to be a source of a lot of expertise in electricity. So that's something interesting to bear in mind for the rest of this presentation. Ireland's peak electricity use is currently about 5.5 gigawatts. I think it was 5.4 last year. That comes from the range of technologies you saw on the last slide, predominantly gas. We're building more gas plants, 2 gigawatts. So for reference, our peak use is 5.4 gigawatts. We're building 2 gigawatts in the next 2 years. And we're phasing out, we've already phased out peat, we're phasing out oil and coal by 2025 is the target. So these these are the projections for Irish electricity going into the future. These numbers are from EirGrid. As you can see, our electricity demand is going to keep growing rapidly and well beyond into the 2030s as well. It's clear we need to construct as much clean electricity supply as we can, from a variety of sources. And just to ensure that our electricity is reliable and affordable, not even taking environmental concerns into account. So regardless of what technologies we decide to build in the future, our electricity system is going to need very ambitious and expensive infrastructure reform for that reason alone. So we need to make sure at this point that when we're deciding which technologies to build, we really understand what all of our options are, and we really understand which mix of technologies, and it'll always be a mix of technologies, is the best one for us. We do this by examining all of our technology options, and we model them to see which mix of technologies gives us the cheapest, most reliable, and most environmentally responsible electricity system. And then critically, we choose that system. So then to further complicate things, in 2019, the Irish government was, I think, the first in the world to declare a climate emergency. And they came out with the Climate Action Plan. So why this complicates things is now we don't just have to meet growing electricity demand, we also have to make sure that it's clean. And they prescribed in the Climate Action Plan that in 2019, that 70% of our electricity would come from variable renewables by 2030, although this year they revised that number upwards to 80%. And they also said in there that we would achieve net zero carbon emissions in the power sector by 2050. But they didn't have any roadmap in there, and that's going to be developed. For the scenario in 2030, we assume, and you can only assume, that this will be implemented, but that will look incredibly different to the current scenario that we have. By 2030, I think our electricity system is going to have to be capable of over 95% non-synchronous generation regularly and 100% at times. Although you probably saw in the news quite recently, we were at over 90% non-synchronous generation during a windy spell in recent weeks. So we're kind of getting on the way there already. We are world leaders in it. So for the roadmap to net zero by 2050, not only does the roadmap not exist, but it's not actually clear with the range of permitted technologies in Ireland how it would be possible to reach that. So what we're probably going to need to do is develop new technologies and permit new technologies. The government's already looking into carbon capture and storage. So we should look into all options that we have available to us. And then we know what would benefit us and what would be achievable and desirable for us once we've evaluated all of these. So without having a roadmap, it's hard to interpret the government's plan to reach net zero by 2050 as anything other than replacing old plant with renewables over time and assuming that 100% variable renewables will be possible by 2050 due to advances in storage and interconnection and demand-side response and whatever other advances there are. And if we can do that, that's amazing. That's fantastic. But we know that that would be even if that is possible, getting there will be very difficult technically. And there are all sorts of concerns that we need to factor into this conversation that I don't really hear about much in popular discourse about the future of our energy system and decarbonizing. Whoops. One of those concerns is the graph that I have here. This is from OECD. It shows that the system cost of generating electricity, so not the cost of the plant, just the cost from your electricity system, increases dramatically as you include more variable renewables in it. The scenario on the far right there, 75% variable renewables, is similar to what Ireland's going to do, 80%. And this number, it's indicative. I wouldn't take this as a hard number really, because it's not done for Ireland, but it could indicate that the cost of electricity could effectively double just from the system costs alone. So this might be our best, getting really high penetration of variable renewables might be our best option to reach net zero. And it's definitely worth discussing. But clearly, when the cost of electricity could be impacted so radically, we really need to seriously assess all of our options. So Ireland doesn't yet have a roadmap. EirGrid are currently working on pathways to a roadmap, but other countries have roadmaps to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So it's worthwhile looking at what else is out there internationally. Over 130 countries have pledged to reach net zero emissions in their power sector by 2050. The International Energy Agency, in a report that came out this year, showing pathways to get to net zero emissions by 2050, said that by 2050, about 70% of global electricity will be coming from wind and solar. And that's largely compatible with what Ireland's kind of aiming for as well, from what we can see. But this variable renewables will need support from other clean technologies, like hydropower, like hydrogen and nuclear power. Within one of, I forget what the name of the scenarios, one of the main median scenarios, they say nuclear power production is going to have to double internationally by 2050. Similarly, the International Panel on Climate Change came out with their kind of their flagship report in 2018 on limiting global temperature changes to 1.5 degrees. They presented mitigation scenarios in which nuclear generation would grow on average 2.5 times from today's level by 2050. And in their middle of the road scenario, so in their median scenario, you saw nuclear increasing sixfold by 2050 and providing 25% of global electricity. Just for reference, today, nuclear provides about 10% of global electricity and about 20% of European electricity. There are individual countries that have roadmaps done, such as the UK, France, Finland, Sweden, and all of these feature either nuclear or hydro or a combination of the two for underpinning their variable renewables to provide system stability. So clearly this is an option that many other countries are looking into and is widely acknowledged to be a good option. So it is something we should definitely be considering for Ireland. So let's look at nuclear power then. So we've heard that other places are looking into it. Why would we look into nuclear power? So the main characteristic, this comes from the UNECE, so United Nations Economic Commission for Europe report that came out last year. They did a life cycle carbon analysis of all major forms of electricity production. I've kind of broken them up into groups here, but nuclear came out the lowest, lower than renewables, lower than hydro. Nuclear power is extremely low carbon. It's an extremely clean way of producing electricity. So this reason alone shows that it should at least be considered if we take the government at their word that the climate emergency is an emergency and that it's something that we should be striving to implement infrastructure changes to combat. We should at least be considering it. The UNECE came out with a different report a few months previous that stated international climate objectives will not be met if nuclear power is excluded. And bearing in mind, they're not looking totally internationally, they're looking in Europe. And they're saying that the share of nuclear in Europe will likely have to increase to meet climate objectives. In addition to carbon emissions, it has really good environmental credentials in other ways. It is a very small footprint of land, which is good for biodiversity, and it uses a lot less materials than systems that are more renewable heavy and more kind of dispersed. So it seems like an environmentally sound option, but there are other considerations. Nuclear power is fundamentally different from renewables in that it's dispatchable. So nuclear power plants function like fossil fuel plants in that they heat up water, and then that turns a turbine, and then that generates electricity. The only real difference is how they heat up the water, and nuclear does it using nuclear fuel, which generates heat, and fossil fuel plants do it by burning fossil fuels. So this has the benefit of fossil fuel plants in providing stability and having dispatchable electricity you can turn on when you need it, but without the associated carbon emissions. It's a good option. Nuclear also has a fantastic safety record. According to the Lancet, it's one of the best electricity generation options for health and human life. Even when you consider all the accidents that have happened, it's still orders of magnitude safer than plants that we have in Ireland, like gas plants. And then on top of that, it looks like it's going to be included in the European Union Sustainable Taxonomy on the basis that the JRC, the Joint Research Centre, or is it Council? I think it's Centre, found that it met all of the does no significant harm criteria to be included as a green technology. So these are pretty good credentials and a pretty good basis for sparking interest in it from an Irish perspective for our electricity future. One of the discussions about nuclear is why don't we have it already in Ireland if it's so great? And one of the big, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well, but one of the big barriers towards it is has been its size. So for nuclear plants to be commercial in decades past, they had to be big, about 1 gigawatt in size, which anyone who's familiar with the Irish power sector will know that is much larger than any one unit currently connected to our grid. You would want your units to be 300 megawatts or less, typically. This means that if one of them cuts out, you have extra reserve to fill in that gap. If you have one giant unit, your outage planning is very delicate, and you would probably want dedicated interconnection associated with it, because we give priority dispatch to renewables. So something that has changed the conversation significantly about nuclear power for Ireland is the commercial realization of small modular reactors. So these are nuclear power plants that are 60 to 300 megawatts in size. They can be other ones, but those are the kind of most commercial ones. We did a study into nuclear, which I'll talk about in a bit, but we looked into some of the kind of main ones. And if you're interested, they're called NuScale, GE Hitachi. EDF is looking into NuWord, is their one. And then there's other kind of more advanced reactors a little bit further down the line using molten salt. So there's a company called Moltex looking into those, terrestrial energy. There's a lot of companies developing these at the moment. In some countries, they're already operational. Russia has had 2, 3 small modular reactors already operational. China, at the end of 2021, brought Hualong 1 online and connected to the grid. So they are operational in other countries. And the main difference between these types of small modular reactors, so not the kind of more advanced ones that use exotic materials like molten salt, but the NuScale one or the GE Hitachi one, is they're all based on existing plants, just scaled down, and they've managed to get costs down to make them commercial and economic. Why they aren't in place already in some countries is because the licensing process for nuclear is extremely cumbersome. So the NuScale plant that you can see on the, oh, actually, I didn't mention the pictures. The picture on the left is the turbine from Hualong 1 in China, the operational plant, and which just looks like a regular turbine, to be honest. And the one on the right is a mock-up of what the NuScale plant would look like. So there are lots of fun architectural designs out there for different novel technologies, but this is one that will actually get built. This will get built in 2027 in the US, and they're signing other projects at the moment as well. I think with Poland, they just signed, was it? Yeah. It was NuScale just signed an MOU with a Polish company to build one of these there by 2029. Poland has no nuclear power as it currently stands and has never had any nuclear power. So the reason why countries are looking into these now and are licensing them now is because they might be useful for climate action. So in addition to Poland, Estonia, which is a country half the size of Ireland, they're going to have their first nuclear power plants running. I think they're aiming for the early 2030s. The Netherlands, France, Slovenia, Hungary, Finland, the Czech Republic, UK, other European countries, and then obviously Canada and the US and various countries are all going to be building new nuclear power plants within coming years to decarbonize their electricity, and critically to do it for kind of lower cost than other alternatives. France's recent, I think last week they announced they'll be building up to 14 new nuclear plants. Not these small ones, they'll be building big gigawatt plants because they've got a much bigger grid, but they are a staple in other countries' decarbonization plans. So it's great to hear about countries that already have nuclear who are going to add more nuclear into their well-established streams, but how would a country like Ireland, if we were to even consider going nuclear, how would we do it? So there is a very good, well-established model internationally called the IAEA milestones approach. The IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency, and Ireland is a member of this. And if we were to develop nuclear, we'd actually have to do it following this milestones approach, or else we wouldn't really get their blessing, and it would be impossible to develop nuclear without them and without their cooperation. So we'd need to follow their structures. So this isn't me saying this would be a lovely timeline. This is the timeline that we would follow if we were developing nuclear. This timeline, where you start at phase 1 and you finish at the end of phase 3, takes between 10 and 15 years. And they know that because they have decades of experience fulfilling this. Last year, 2 countries came in under the time limit. This is a well-established way of developing nuclear for the first time as a country. And where it begins is at the start of the very first phase, a country decides that they're going to look into nuclear. This is where Ireland should be. We should be deciding now that we will consider it. By the end of phase 1, you typically have answered, so you'll have done a thing called a pre-feasibility study, and you'll have developed your national position, and you'll have answered key questions like, why would we build nuclear? And do we want it here? And by the end of that milestone, so at the start of phase 2, you've decided whether or not you're going to go ahead with nuclear. And if you decide not to, then you don't continue with the phases. But if you decide to go ahead with nuclear, phase 2 is the preparatory work for kind of contracting and the construction of nuclear plants after a policy decision has been taken. So in that phase, your key organizations, as well as legal and regulatory frameworks, are established. Then in your third phase is when you start to contract people to build it, and when you license things. And then by the end of the third phase, you have your electricity from your nuclear power plant. So from deciding that you're going to look into it to having electricity from nuclear power takes 10 to 15 years. The milestones approach is extremely prescriptive with how a country looks into developing nuclear. And there's a lot of support given to countries doing this. And there are many countries doing this at the moment. The milestones approach includes 19 key infrastructure issues that require specific actions during each of the 3 phases. And completion of the actions for each phase represents the achievement of that milestone. So bearing that in mind, 1840 conducted a preliminary study into nuclear power, and we followed the structure given by the IAEA milestones approach. The purpose of this study and the reason why we formed and how we all met each other was that we were concerned that there weren't any proposals in place to reach net zero emission by 2050. We all met each other after the Climate Action Plan came out. We thought that we would be, as power sector professionals and people with experience in nuclear internationally, we could see that the government was already looking into some of the other options like carbon capture and storage. And we thought we would fill the information vacuum around nuclear power in Ireland and help to the government to see that this is a viable option and to kind of compel them to do their own study. So when I talk about the study, please bear in mind, I am not saying, it is not meant to make a decision on whether or not Ireland should build it. I don't know if Ireland should build nuclear or not. The whole point of this is to highlight that whether or not it's an option and whether or not it's worth looking into more. So how we started going about that was, first of all, we asked, what could we build? And we did a technology review. And then we kind of asked, well, why would there be any motivation for doing this? And we ran a model to see what it could look like here. And then using the results of that model and following on from it, we decided to expand our work and start looking into the milestones approach and the infrastructure issue and show how it could be done. So for the technology review, we looked into 5 plants. Again, we weren't exhaustive with this because this is just meant to highlight options. The plant that we ended up choosing in the end, we reviewed them in terms of engineering readiness, technology readiness, supply chain, licensing, carbon emissions cost, environmental credentials cost. I think that was it. And licensing, I don't know if I mentioned that. And we came up with, we thought the GE Hitachi 300 megawatt plant, grid compatibility, that was it. The GE Hitachi plant, 300 megawatt plant would be most suitable for the purposes of our study. But again, we're not paid by any company, we're not endorsing any technology. But we used, when we were looking to nuclear in Ireland, we considered a 300 megawatt plant that has a steam turbine. Interestingly enough, this is the plant that Estonia are going to go with. They're going to build a fleet of these, and there are plenty of other countries. The US are going to be building a few of them. There are other countries looking into these as well. I think the Czech Republic. So it turns out this was actually quite a good decision to compare to how other countries are doing their policies and decisions. So then we went into the why. So when we had the kind of technology options chosen, we'd identified there are a range of suitable technologies for Ireland, from just that pure tech review kind of perspective. We decided to see, like, would there be any motivation to pursuing this any further? And we did this before we had decided to do the rest of the report. This was kind of to see for ourselves as well. And we ran we ran a model with 2 scenarios. So both scenarios were exactly the same. They were done in 10-year increments. And again, this is just indicative from 2020 to 2030 to 2040 to 2050. So up to 2030, both the scenarios are exactly the same. We assume the government's going to implement the Climate Action Plan as it stands, which at the time was 70% variable renewables, but is now 80% variable renewables, but the numbers are all largely quite similar then. So for the first scenario, we made the assumption that I mentioned earlier. Without a roadmap from the government at the moment, and looking at the list of currently permitted technologies, we have to assume that the government is planning on just continuing to expand variable renewables until they reach 100% integration by 2050. And we just assume that that's technically possible. And when we looked into that, we took all the numbers from the respective associations and organizations to do with all these technologies. So we looked into a range of renewable technologies. And so we took the numbers for the wind one from Wind Energy Ireland, and we took them all from like their kind of representative groups. So none of these numbers are biased. They're not coming from us. And that was kind of what we based our kind of technology decisions on throughout the model. So the least cost ones. A lot of these are a little bit optimistic, but I feel like this is only an indicative study, so that's fine. And if anything, having this first scenario be a bit optimistic is kind of good, because then it really highlights what the second scenario means. So the second scenario is we get up to our 70% variable renewables, but then as our firm generation, so our dispatchable generation, gets taken offline, we start replacing it with nuclear. And what we end up with is, now we also have included plans for expanding interconnection and battery storage, and we took all the demand profiles, and all of that came from EirGrid. So those were consistent for the two scenarios. So what we found was by 2050, we had in scenario 2, we had a mix that included 18% nuclear power, and that's what that looks like there. That's our second scenario. Sorry about the poor quality image. So you can see the big green block is the renewables, and then this navy one is nuclear. It still says we have a little bit of fossil fuels. That's because we have the waste to power as sources, and that's categorized as 50% fossil fuels, 50% renewables. And there's a number, there's a certain amount of inbuilt carbon in the system. So we say 18 for zero, so 18 for net zero. Realistically, it's 18 for minimize, because you can't reach net zero in the power sector without carbon capture and storage, realistically. So the blue line running through this is the carbon emissions. And you can see that they reach a minimum. In our model, it actually happened in 2037. We could minimize the emissions to their lowest by then. So this happened faster than in the first scenario. In our second scenario, so when we then use this technology mix as the basis for comparison, and we found that the curtailment rate was obviously quite a bit lower in the second scenario. So we went from a curtailment rate of the renewable energy from, I think, 16% down to about 9%. We also found that the second scenario used 99% less land than the first scenario, and used 90% less iron and steel and 90% less concrete and cement than the first scenario as well. And this shouldn't be a surprise. When you have distributed energy generation like the first scenario, you need a lot more plant, and it needs to be really oversized to ensure that you have energy when it's not that windy, when it's not that sunny. So it can be done, I'm sure, but you need a lot of plant to do it. And it's important to take that into consideration when looking at what mix you'd want. We also didn't take, it's important to note, this is purely the kind of, all of our costs and comparisons that we do in this are purely the kind of cost of the plant, and that we don't take into account any of the systems costs, which was the graph I showed earlier that showed that rises dramatically for systems with lots of renewables. We didn't really think that was majorly meaningful at this point of very early looking into it, but it's something, that kind of system cost analysis is critical to be done when we're deciding what mix we actually need, and definitely should be done. So for our two scenarios, this ended up being the kind of levelized cost of electricity. So the cost to produce each unit of electricity, each megawatt hour of electricity for both scenarios. So both scenarios are the same. I don't know why the first one, yeah, anyway, both scenarios are the same for 2020 and 2030. 2040 is where you see the divergence. And you see that the scenario for nuclear, and all the numbers we took for nuclear, sorry, I forgot to mention, for renewables, all of our numbers were from renewables associations. For nuclear, they were from nuclear vendors, but we doubled them just to make them a bit more conservative. And you see that it's competitive. So here is our why we would look into nuclear. So from there, we can start looking into how and what sort of approach would we take. So the IAEA milestones approach has 19 key infrastructure issues that you look into. And I don't have enough time. I would love to go through all of them. We've gone through 12 of them in some detail in our report, which is available at 18for0.ie. And I would highly recommend you check it out if you're interested in nuclear energy development for Ireland, or just Ireland's energy future in general. And you can always send us questions about it too at a later date. So some of the key infrastructure issues relate to frameworks. And so this is a national position, a legal framework, regulatory framework, and then kind of more supply chain things. These aren't the exact descriptions of the infrastructure issues, but for the purpose of this presentation, this is how I've categorized them. So we have a lot of the frameworks in place to develop nuclear as it stands. We actually don't have a national position on nuclear power as it's at the moment, but we looked into, we took other national positions like the Climate Action Plan, our national planning framework. I used to work in planning, so I love that one as a reference, which makes significant reference to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we also took them as a national position, and then the national position on radiation protection. And all of those were amenable to at least looking into nuclear power as an option. None of those prohibited nuclear power. Legal framework is where it gets a little bit interesting, because nuclear power is not permitted under Irish law. It is currently, it's stated in law that it's not permitted. So it goes a little step further than just not being permitted. It's stated that it's not permitted in 2 pieces of legislation, but both of them are single lines that would be legislatively straightforward to remove. And in developing our legal framework for developing a nuclear power sector and in permitting nuclear power and in licensing it, the IAEA has substantial resources and helps and supports for countries doing this that aren't just a nice little extra thing you can avail of, but are something that you kind of need to avail of. And we'd also benefit from decades of experience of nuclear power in other countries. The civil nuclear power sector has been going for over 60 years, so we could learn from other countries. Similar to our regulatory framework, I mean, we already regulate the use of radioactive materials in Ireland. I mean, we use them in industry and veterinary and hospitals, dentistry, education. So that's already regulated by the EPA. Ireland, as a member of the IAEA, gets reviewed on their kind of management of nuclear materials and on all their, the waste management processes, all this regularly every few years. And their most recent review, which was, I think it was either last year or the year before, and in all the reviews before that, Ireland's been highly praised by the IAEA for having a particularly knowledgeable and well-run system within the EPA. So that would be a strong framework that we could pull on in developing a regulatory framework. And then Ireland is also a member of Euratom, which ensures it's kind of, insurance for supply chain for nuclear power in Europe. And it would give us security of fuel supply. And they also ensure knowledge sharing and skill sharing. So it would help us to kind of set up the nuclear sector in the first place. So then other infrastructure issues are, I think, more interestingly to the engineers, the grid and site. So nuclear power plants in the study that we looked into, the technology review, they're all steam driven, and they all provide more inertia than open cycle gas turbines of similar output. So that includes gas turbines in carbon capture and storage plants. Having your dispatchable electricity, your synchronous electricity, is really important for providing essential system services like inertia and fault ride through and reactive power. And that makes the integration of variable renewables easier. The size of the plants that we looked into, so 300 megawatts, are suitable and fine for outage planning in Ireland because they're similar size to gas plants that we use at the moment anyway. And we believe the scenario using nuclear plants as opposed to relying fully on renewables would improve security of supply. We would have lots of smaller plants, especially compared to like larger thermal units, such as large carbon capture and storage plants. Having more smaller units inherently improve security of supply, but it would also improve security through diversification of our fuel. So the second scenario had much less plant than the first one, and it was far less distributed, it was more centralized. So the expansion of the transmission system would also be much more straightforward and significantly cheaper. And then small modular reactors also have significant power to X capabilities. So in particular, I'd like to highlight the molten salt reactors that they use molten salt within them, and they can be used for energy storage using like a thermal salt storage tank, which is interesting, but they're a little bit further away. So the other plants that we looked at, the steam ones, that you can get usable heat from them, and you can get other uses from it. So that's something worth bearing in mind for grid integration. And then for site, there are already loads of suitable sites. In the 70s, Ireland did a study into nuclear development in Ireland, and they found several sites, and they put planning permission together from them in Carcer Point. And in many countries, so in the US, there were plans in Wyoming announced recently to build nuclear plant on an old coal plant site. In Ireland, Money Point's going to get decommissioned, and there are lots of benefits to developing nuclear on old fossil fuel infrastructure sites, and we're going to have loads of these in the future in Ireland. And it makes the best use of existing infrastructure, including transmission, which is incredibly expensive, but also potentially workforce and that kind of soft infrastructure as well. And they tend to be already quite well sited anyway in terms of cooling water. So, and like having good roads and access. So we found that, that infrastructure issue is not really so much of an issue, especially not in Ireland. Another one, I've dedicated a whole slide to this one on waste, is because we get asked about it a lot. And what would nuclear waste management look like in Ireland? And obviously nuclear waste management exists in Ireland. We have waste streams for nuclear waste, but that's low-level nuclear waste. And the type of waste most people are interested in is 3% of the nuclear waste that gets generated from nuclear power plants. And we have a whole webinar on this on our YouTube channel if you're really interested. But that's called high-level waste. And it's high level because it's generating a certain amount of heat, which means it needs a special type of storage. So what you can see in the picture here is Zulag in Switzerland. I actually got to visit this site. It's really impressive. And this is where all of the high level waste, so the spent fuel, the used up nuclear fuel from all of Switzerland's power plants are vitrified and stored here. Nuclear power is about 40% of Switzerland's electricity, and this is about 50 years worth of waste. And you can see that little kind of blue dot in the middle is a person standing for scale, and it all fits in this hole. So the actual volume of waste is quite manageable, and it is an extremely well managed waste stream internationally. Out of any kind of hazardous waste from any industry, it has a kind of model of how you should manage it. In 60 years of nuclear waste management, from civil nuclear, from power plants, there has never been a significant environmental release of nuclear waste. And I'm not saying that as someone peddling the nuclear industry. I'm saying that as a fact, and I'm saying that as we could benefit from that in Ireland. We could benefit from those decades of experience. We already manage nuclear waste here. It's not really clear that this should be an option, or not an option, that this should be an issue. So the other kind of last two infrastructure considerations are really the one. I've rolled them into people. So the first one is workforce. And so I commonly hear that Ireland might not be able to build nuclear because we don't have the experience of it. If you're going to develop a nuclear power program in a country, you need workforce for an organization called the NEPO, organization, which is the government group that would do the study into whether or not we need nuclear, and that's about 5 people. We'd need people to work in the regulatory body, which is up to 50 people, maybe 20 to 50 people. And then we would need people to work in the operating organization, which is several hundred. Especially for the kind of size fleet of nuclear power plants we'd be looking at in our model. So we looked at 6. The vast majority of those people exist, like if one was to get built tomorrow, exist in Ireland. fewer than 5% of workers in a nuclear power plant are nuclear engineering specific. Nuclear engineers design nuclear power plants. Technicians operate nuclear power plants. Over 3/4 of people who work in US nuclear power plants as in technical roles don't have a degree or don't need a degree. They're not at that level, they're at technician level. But these are good, skilled, highly paid jobs that are actually quite desirable. And it is entirely consistent that Ireland would be able to supply these workers and that there are people who would want to do them, especially coming from areas that are going to lose their fossil fuel plants. And the big thick line running throughout this shows you the timeline of developing nuclear and when you would need the staff to come online. So in this one, it shows nuclear coming online in 14 years, so within the milestones approach. And you see the vast majority of staff get recruited within the 8 to 14 year mark. So you have years of notice to recruit these staff and get them on board. And then the other factor of people is societal. So there is a perception that Irish people are anti-nuclear because there were protests against nuclear development in the 1970s in Carnsore Point. But that might not be true for today. There was no real information on this until quite recently. The Journal did a poll, I think with the Morocco research, there were 1,200 respondents, so the results are statistically significant. And they were asked the question, should Ireland build a nuclear power station to increase clean energy supplies? They weren't asked, should we consider it? They were asked, should we build it? And 43% of Irish people said yes, 43% of Irish people said no, and 15% were unsure. What's more stark is that 60% of young people said yes, 19 said no, and the rest were unsure. And that's kind of consistent with what I found. You know, I've been doing 18 for Zero for 2 years. And most people I know are a little soft kind of feeling of no. You do get some people who are hardline against it, and those tend to be the legacy environmentalists. Apologies if any of you are here. But environmentalists in the 1970s in Ireland who protested Carnsore Point weren't necessarily wrong to do so. I mean, they had very different concerns from the kind of climate activists now. There was this big conflation with nuclear power and nuclear war, and there wasn't a plan for the waste. It was a much more alive topic of what do you do with the waste that has now been answered. So now the real threats that we face and the real threats climate activists care about are biodiversity loss, air quality, climate change, just transition. All of those are easier to fight with reliable carbon-free electricity, which has a small footprint and no pollutant emissions. And nuclear isn't the only way to do it, but it is a way to do it. And a lot of climate activists recognize that. So they don't have any particular qualms with nuclear power, especially in the younger generation that don't have those conflations that the older ones do. But even accepting that kind of overwhelming scientific evidence that nuclear will be instrumental in fighting climate change, there's still a persistent belief that Irish people are just incapable of delivering large-scale infrastructure projects because of NIMBYism, and we shouldn't even discuss decarbonisation plans like building nuclear power plants. But in my 2 years of voluntarily campaigning to get people to consider nuclear power, I found that is the most single popular reason people cite for being against nuclear power and for being against considering nuclear power. And by not considering it, they're defaulting to we shouldn't build it. So they effectively are against it, which is frustratingly circular logic. So they're saying we should oppose nuclear because it will take too long to build because of NIMBYism. But the reason why it will take too long is because people oppose it on that first basis. So that's not a good system to have. You know, we're in a climate emergency, as I've said several times, and it's not really good enough to say we're not going to look into a low carbon form of electricity generation. And we don't have time to be deciding if we have enough time to consider our different options. We need to be considering all of our options urgently. And this is something most Irish people can understand and can support. Without fully and scientifically examining all of our technology options, we're not able to figure out which mix of technologies gives us the cheapest, most reliable, and most environmentally responsible electricity system. So we owe it to ourselves and to future generations not to discount technologies we're just unfamiliar with or kind of vaguely uncomfortable with. We have to start talking about it now and consider it as an option. So what next? Under the most recent climate action plan, pathways to net zero emissions by 2050 are being drawn up by EirGrid, and they're going to come out in the third quarter of next year. The government is then going to choose a roadmap in 2024. It is critical that every technology option is included in these pathways. We will not know the optimal mix without including all of our options. We need a proper study into nuclear power for Ireland to complement this as well. In order to do this, we need to remove the two pieces of legislation that effectively prohibit it. They don't permit it, because this has had a chill effect on research. This is one of the motivations for 1840 to fill in this information vacuum. And then finally, we need to fill in the kind of information or the energy policy vacuum that has existed as a result as well. So we need leadership to build this national conversation. We need it from politicians, we need it from industry, we need it from journalists, we need it from individuals broaching the topic of nuclear power with their family and friends, and we especially need it from engineers and scientists. So for anyone else interested in this, we have a report on nuclear energy development for Ireland. It's available on our website at 1840.ie. Apologies, I've run over time, but I hope some of you have some questions for me because I love to talk about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for an absolutely excellent presentation. People really enjoyed it, as noted by the questions posted. I noted the questions during your presentation, and I will run through them now. The first question from Chris Noonan. Is nuclear energy truly dispatchable? Is it still economically viable if it isn't running steadily throughout the day?
That's an interesting question. So nuclear power plants do have good ramping capabilities, and something that immediately highlights that is France's electricity is 70% from nuclear power and has been for a long time, and they are able to integrate that with variable renewables. There have been many points throughout the last year where their grid has been entirely renewables and nuclear. So off the bat, that illustrates that and says that it is dispatchable. But when you look at the capabilities of the kind of plants we were looking at, they could ramp up and down. So they can ramp down to about 30%. Once you have them on, you don't want to turn them off completely for obvious reasons. So there are ramping capabilities, especially when you consider a fleet of smaller reactors. So the traditional idea that a big plant can't be turned up and down, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but having a series of 300 megawatt plants that can all be tweaked a certain amount gives a lot more flexibility as well. Sorry, what was the rest of the question?
Yes, I think you've answered that one. Is nuclear energy truly dispatchable? Is it still economically viable if it isn't running steadily throughout the day?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's actually worth noting France's electricity is significantly cheaper than Ireland's as well. So that also vouches for the economic viability of varying the output.
Next question from David McGee. Are there currently any research programs going on into nuclear power in Ireland? There's a lot of research taking place elsewhere into the next generation reactors.
I wish there was. I would love if there was. 1840 is entirely voluntary, but if we weren't, we would love to be doing that. Ireland is not particularly involved in that sort of research internationally. Ireland does research into radiation technologies and medical physics, and in other types of energy systems. There's a lot of tidal research going on in Ireland, a lot of hydrogen. But unfortunately, no, nothing into advanced nuclear, which is a bit of a shame. The UK has a lot. France has a lot. US, Canada, China, lots of other countries do, but not Ireland.
Next question from Philip Beck. If so many countries are planning increase in nuclear, wouldn't Ireland be replacing the security of supply conditions of oil, gas with uranium, whereas wind and sun are supplied over and over again by nature, with no need for the environmental destruction of huge ore mining?
That feels like a bit of a biased question because of the last bit. The life cycle carbon emissions, the graph or the chart that I had at the beginning showing that nuclear had the lowest out of any major form, that included mining. So just bearing in mind, that included all life cycle of it. As for security of supply, the OECD comes out with a red book every few years, and they talk about uranium reserves. And I think that they show at current rate of use, there's 150 years or something of conventional uranium reserves. But that being said, some of the reactors that I talked about in this presentation and some of the reactors that will get built in the 2030s use spent fuel from other reactors as a fuel. So the idea that we're going to need to keep mining it becomes less important. And also nuclear fuel can be reprocessed and recycled. We touch on that, actually we cover that in our most recent webinar, if you want to find it on our YouTube channel on managing nuclear waste. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Next one from Seamus Doyle. Germany has a policy of decommissioning nuclear power following the Japan accident. Germany has today announced that the Baltic Russian gas pipeline will not now be commissioned due to Ukraine. Do you think Germany will reconsider nuclear with the current East-West tensions?
I hope so. I went to Berlin in November and I met up. It was small, symbolic. I mean, the decision to close the nuclear plants had been taken years before. It was a bit more of a symbolic sort of protest. But I joined Dr. James Hansen, who some of you might know as the original climate scientist. He testified to US Congress in 1988 that climate change was real and happening. And he was there to symbolically protest against the nuclear plants in Germany being shut down because of the environmental impact that has in Europe. Also, I suppose that's a little bit separate to the security of supply concern, but that's also very strong and a very current geopolitical consideration. I hope that it at least gets reconsidered and reevaluated, because the original decision doesn't seem to have been made based on any science. It seems to have been a complete knee-jerk reaction. And for something as critical as electricity infrastructure for Europe, we can't be making decisions based on that. They have to be based on models and hard science.
Another one from Seamus Doyle. An elephant in the room. Spent fuel has a half-life of thousands of years. How is spent fuel to be handled so as not to replace climate change as the global energy problem?
Okay, I think that the idea of having long-term problems it is kind of like an emotional, like satisfying to say one might replace the other. I would say in no way would management of nuclear fuel be in any way comparable to climate change ever. So we're just going to start off on that level. But I will say to kind of engage in a more meaningful way on the topic, spent fuel management nuclear waste management, so high level waste management is an extremely advanced kind of area that's gotten loads of funding and loads of research over decades. So if Ireland was coming into this, we would already benefit from all that. There's been a lot of discussion that, yeah, okay, we know how to handle it in the interim, we know how to store it for now, but we don't know what to do with it in the long term and the ultra long term. But that isn't true. Finland is currently building a deep geologic repository, which is a final resting place for its used nuclear fuel, and Sweden has just permitted one, so it will be getting constructed soon, and there's plenty of other countries that will be building them. The reason why they haven't been built so far, and this is the preferred way to do it, the reason why they haven't been built so far is because it's not entirely clear that nuclear waste is waste in a traditional sense, because you can recycle it and you can repurpose it. And in the new generation of nuclear reactors that burn up old nuclear waste as fuel, do you really want to get rid of your waste? Do you really want to get rid of your spent fuel if you could use it again? And it's so easy to store because we have these brilliant systems in place from decades of experience. So that it isn't an issue currently, and that it's easy enough to store on land means that people are a bit reluctant to bury it because it could potentially be a resource. And that has implications for, hundreds of years from now. How much waste is actually there in volume is really how much will we be using up between now and then, which could be all of it as well. Yeah.
A question from Aidan. What is the timeline for the retirement of existing combined cycle gas turbine fleet? Does it fit in with the milestone timeline for the introduction of small nuclear reactors?
Oh, that's a great question. There's no timeline for phasing out CCGT. In our study, in our model, we considered that at the end of the life of each gas plant, it would be switched off and replaced with renewables. That isn't actually realistic. And we assume they'd all be gone by 2050. That's not realistic, because without anything to replace them and without significant advances in other technologies like in storage, that wouldn't be possible. And it's not good to bank on that. And the government's still building these. There's plants being built now and like being commissioned now, or licensed now. So there's no plan to get rid of the gas plants. But if you look at older fleet being retired, I think it's entirely consistent with, we think that we could have the first nuclear plant online in the late 2030s. That would be consistent with some of the gas fleet being retired. But you also have to bear in mind our electricity consumption is still growing. So whether or not they'd want to be retired is another question. It's all very complicated. There's so many factors feeding into it.
A question from Anonymous. There's no legislation blocking nuclear in Northern Ireland. In the study, I noticed that the peak demand was 5.4 gigawatts. Is the 1840 report only considering the Republic of Ireland?
So we actually have members from Northern Ireland. On that slide with over the 11 members on it, 2 of them are Northern Irish. We look at it on an all-Ireland basis, Our model was for the Republic of Ireland, but all of the infrastructure considerations we took were on an all-Ireland basis, because if either part of Ireland was going to develop nuclear, you would need the consent of the other one, and because it would be such a big infrastructure consideration, and politically it would be quite a hot topic. I think it would be great if Northern Ireland looked into it, not necessarily built it. I mean, I don't know if it would be the best option for any of us, but it's definitely worth looking into in Northern Ireland, because they would be covered by the UK Atomic Energy Agency, and that would potentially streamline licensing compared to setting up a whole system here in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland. And then we could benefit from it because we'd be using their electricity because we're interconnected.
There are a number of questions which relate to security of supply, which I think have been covered already. So I'll move on.
Can I just say, for anyone interested in security of supply, the Irish Academy of Engineering came out with a really good report on the security of our electricity system up to 2030. It came out not that long ago, I think like last summer. It doesn't go beyond 2030, but it raises a lot of really good questions and really good points on fuel security for anyone asking questions you might be interested.
Is there any question as to what the cost of energy would be for an SMR, and what assumptions have been made in coming to the value, payback, costs, periods, etc.?
Okay, if you're really interested in this topic, I would recommend looking at Appendix B in our report. But I will talk, there's no hard data on it at the moment, because they haven't been built outside of Russia and China, which have different financing schemes because they're state down. The models we'd be kind of looking at, and like the numbers we'd be looking at, would be closer to kind of other Western countries. Like, you know, you'd look kind of more like the US or the European countries who are looking at developing small modular reactors. So we had a webinar in January, which I highly recommend, on funding and financing, or the economics of new nuclear programs. And the CEO of a company from Estonia called Fermi Energia talked about their business plan, and he has some numbers in it that are very good. A lot of them come from vendors, but then have been scaled up in various ways. For our model, we just flat out doubled it, because there's so much uncertainty around it, because they haven't actually been built. But there are companies and there are countries, you know, with business plans and with roadmaps based on these, who have much better numbers. So I'd recommend looking into our webinar with the CEO from Fermi Energia.
Okay, I'll finish off with this last question from Wayne Brace. Flexibility is king. How flexible are modular reactors? Currently, conventional reactors may be dispatched off during a high wind scenario and then may be back on 4 hours later. Base load would have to be very low for this plant if it was to be designed to stay on.
Yeah, so this kind of ties back into the first question quite nicely. So you don't really want to switch off and switch back on, although to be honest, that's true for most thermal plant. For most nuclear plants, you don't want to get below kind of 30% is when you start running into kind of escalating costs for turning on and off. it's interesting, like, you know, when we think about the type of flexibility that nuclear plants have now is fine for the systems we have now. But yeah, for the future, it's going to become a much bigger issue where, you know, we need to be 100% supplied by variable renewables at certain times, especially from 2030 and beyond. So that's where kind of power to X becomes a lot more attractive. So yeah, maybe generating hydrogen, possibly. There might not really be an economic case for that, but certainly diverting the water into district heating or into uses like in industry or into kind of thermal storage, like from the molten salt plants, could be particularly useful then. But yeah.
Thanks very much, Sarah. You've answered those questions expertly. I will now pass you back to our chair, Ching-Man Ching.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Sarah, for a very interesting presentation. I would now like to invite Oliver Galliard, Chair of the Energy, Environment and Climate Action Division of Engineer Ireland, to propose a vote of thanks. Thank you. Oliver.
Thank you, Ching. The race to net zero is typically framed as a shift from fossil fuel, such as coal or natural gas, towards renewables, such as wind and solar. On one hand, the role of nuclear power in the clean energy transition is very often overlooked. On the other hand, nuclear power is a complex and dividing topic with many factors to consider. As engineers and citizens, we should not shy away from these discussions. It's why, on behalf of Engineers Ireland, Energy Environment Committee, Climate Action Committee, we were delighted to co-host this talk with EIT. And on our behalf, I would like to thank Sarah Cullen, co-founder of 1840, for this talk and bringing some of these considerations to us. Plenty of food for thought. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Oliver. And thank you again. And thank you to all the attendees for being here this evening at Sarah's excellent presentation. Now I would like to pass it to Chris to close off the webinar. Chris?
I would like to thank Sarah again for her excellent presentation, and I look forward to seeing you at our next one. So good evening and good night.